Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I'm here with the author of an absolutely fantastic and fun remix, let's say, of Arthurian literature. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
I'm Thomas D. Lee, and I'm the author of Perilous Times.
This book was so much fun, and
Thank you.
You're welcome. Before I fell into libraries, I was a medievalist, and I wrote a dissertation on Crusader masculinities, and so I am a person who has thought a lot about medieval literature and gender and all that. But I'm really curious if you can tell us, what was your journey from researcher to novelist? Like, how did you how did you come to this material? How did you get interested in medieval literature? And what made you want to turn your research into fiction?
That's a great question. I almost went the other way around to an extent because I was interested in history and medieval literature before I went down an academic route to become a researcher. I did a history undergraduate degree rather than an English degree. So I've always been interested in the past, particularly the medieval past. And I was fascinated with the Middle Ages. I moved on from them too quickly, really, to focus on other eras later on in my undergraduate degree. And it was only when I was a few years later working as a teaching assistant that the Brexit referendum happened here in the UK, and it was the same year that Trump got elected over there, and all sorts of other things were happening that made me think maybe it's time for King Arthur to come back. And I wasn't the only person having those thoughts. There were people tweeting about it, and there was a wonderful story of a girl in Sweden somewhere finding a sword in a lake, and everything seemed to be coming together towards a sort of Arthurian moment. And the idea seemed very funny to me. I think that what if Arthur came back, and would that help? And the answer to me almost immediately was probably not. It would probably make things worse. And that seemed inherently funny to me. And it was funny enough that I thought, right, well, I actually have to do research now, and I have to become an Arthurian expert, which I very much wasn't beforehand. I'd read books as a kid like The Weird Stone of Brisingamen, which is very popular over here by Alan Garner, about Alderley Edge, because my family come from around that area. And I remember doing drawings of medieval knights when I was a teenager and thinking that I wanted to write something about them. But it was only when I had that idea about sort of Brexit and climate change and Arthurian fiction all coming together that I went and did research, and very slowly over the course of several years, and including the COVID pandemic, when I had not much else to do, I became a bit of an Arthurian expert and found out who all of these knights actually are and what they're supposed to have done. And that allowed me to move forward right confidently about it.
That's so interesting. And, it's really interesting to, I guess, how do I introduce this? So I was in England for Brexit. I was in London for a month and a half doing some research. And then right after Brexit, I went to Swansea for a conference. And it was really odd to be somewhere for something so historic, and to think of, something that is in my living memory as like a historic moment is still sort of weird, but I remember at the time, all of my friends at the conference being like, please take this as a warning. Like, we didn't think this was going to happen. Please don't let Trump happen. And I'm like, well, I'll see what I can do. And it didn't work. But, I really love this idea of, placing like very recent history in this much vaster time span, to sort of like consider our own the history that we are living through as other time periods would view it, is sort of like a really interesting practice.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I only realized once I started writing this book that that's what Arthur is for. It's what he's always been for. Because Arthur didn't really exist, although there's some Welsh historians crying out in anguish right now because they've censored me saying that. And he exists as a literary device for interrogating the present. and you sort of go into the past and get some King Arthur legitimacy for whatever it is you're proposing in the present, and whether that's a sort of medieval 12th century chivalry, or later on the Tudors used this sort of Welsh Arthurian connection to back up their own kind of royal legitimacy. And in World War II, you've got Churchill standing at the dispatch box comparing Spitfire pilots to Arthurian knights. And I think that's almost what Arthur has always been, the way of looking at the present through this sort of lens of the past in a way that is sort of, I don't know, it helps to strip away some of the complexities of the present, because you think, what would this person from the past think about what's happening now? At least that's why it was useful for me, writing Kay and Lancelot as these characters who have that historical perspective on current events or on events that are just around the corner and hopefully not going to happen in exactly the same way I described them in the book. But wait and see.
Do you also maybe see it as a little bit of a like an act of reclamation? Because it occurred to me while you were talking that both here and there, Trump and Brexit and all that trafficked a lot in medieval imagery, usually for very conservative purposes, like Crusader imagery and a lot of like Celtic knotwork and all these different traditions getting wrapped up and being appropriated and misused.
Absolutely.
Did you conceive of this as sort of no, let's take back the medieval?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. I used to be part of a medieval reenactment society where we dressed up as Normans, and that was a very loud conversation that we were having as reenactors. There were people within our reenactment group who were sort of doing it for reasons that I found grotesque, and because they had a nationalist ideology. And then there were other people in the group who were coming at it from an entirely different perspective, a sort of very left-wing queer perspective, but just enjoyed hitting each other with sticks, which is why I was there. And absolutely. I think, in the UK, we have a newspaper, the Daily Express, which has a tiny little crusader on the strapline. I read a great article called, The Little Crusader Who Wanted His Country Back, and it's an explanation for why Brexit happened. I think the medieval and everything about St. George and everything is really interwoven with that pernicious nationalistic strain of the English character that led to Brexit, and that is right at the heart of all of the rhetoric about small boats and immigrants at the moment. And I think it's very important to look back at the past and to actually point out that this stuff has very little in common with the past, particularly in the sort of Roman period and the post-Roman period, because when we imagine Arthur to have existed, Britain was a very diverse place. There were people from all over the Roman Empire, and we have archaeological evidence of that. And it's equally ridiculous to use Arthur as a tool of white supremacy and nationalism than it is to use him for anything else. And when people write queer Arthuriana, or they write Arthurian stories with Black people in them and immigrants in them, you get criticized for historical inaccuracy. But it's equally inaccurate to use Arthur as a sort of nationalistic stone as well, I think. Especially because he was Welsh. So when English nationalists try and use Arthur for this stuff, it baffles me slightly.
That's a very good point. And I think it is really worth pointing out that all of this stuff is already there, because when I was in grad school, I remember trying in vain one day to explain queer theory to my mother, and she was trying to grapple with it, and she's like, so is it like adding queerness to things? And I'm like, no, it's really like uncovering what's already there.
Yes.
And I think that people who've only encountered Arthur through the super serious 20th 21st century adaptations usually aren't ready for how weird Arthur
deeply weird, in a way that I find really enthralling and entertaining. And I think that's how it's supposed to be read.
Yes. Yeah, I think the first Arthurian text that I encountered in college in an academic environment was Yvain. And it's I was like, oh, this is funny. This is actually, the whole point is to be funny,
Absolutely.
And I love just really, leaning into that kind of playful spirit of the source text.
Which is why the most authentic adaptation of of Arthur, rather, in terms of tone, is Monty Python and the Holy Grail, because it captures that silliness in a way that other films don't. And when you have a film like the 2004 King Arthur film that says this is how it really happened, it completely misses the point by not even striving to capture the authentic tone of the original Arthurian literature, which is something that The Green Knight does very well as well. Instead of playing it for laughs, it takes that weirdness and plays it very sincerely in a very kind of beautiful art house way. And I'm much more interested in embracing the weirdness than in pretend that it's not there.
Mm. Speaking of that, because something that also made me think about The Green Knight while reading your book was, and I don't want to, reveal too much, so I'm going to try to like be opaque in how I talk about this, was the depiction of Arthur. Because I think a lot of modern readers do also tend to think of the Knights of the Round Table as like medieval superheroes, or godlike figures who are like
Yes.
paragons of morality and strength and always make the right choices and this and that. And that's not really what's going on either. Like they're all very
No.
human. They make terrible choices frequently.
Terrible
They're
choices.
very weak, And like, so could you talk a little bit about let's see, what drove what characters you chose to write about, and what was your relationship with like the source material in how you chose to depict them? I know that's a very big question, but I'm really
No, that's really interesting. I'm trying to think because I think I picked Kay largely at random before I even knew that he was King Arthur's foster brother. I hadn't even done that level. That's one of the most basic parts of the story is that Arthur gets fostered by Kay and his parents, and anyone who's watched the Disney cartoon Sword in the Stone film will know that. But I picked Kay because he's always described as saying the wrong thing or putting his foot in it or telling a joke that nobody thinks is funny. And I warmed to him enormously because of that. And I thought that was the character I wanted. And I decided to make him black because it seemed to me that that might be an explanation why he's always the butt of everyone's jokes and why he's unpopular in all of the stories. And there is a certain precedent for it, even in the original literature, because you have Saracen and Moorish knights like Palamedes and Morian, who are described as black in the original material. So I had Kay, who I always picture as Idris Elba when I'm imagining Kay. I bring that up whenever I possibly can. And I knew I needed another knight. There needed to be one knight who was sick of doing what he was told. He decided to side with the underdog and try and fix what was broken in society. And then I needed another knight who was still doing what he was told to an extent and who was perfectly happy working for the establishment. I very quickly had this image of Lancelot, not just as a government hitman, sort of reluctant, but also as a gay man and as a man who enjoys creature comforts enough that a spa day and a stiff glass of whiskey is enough to make him go, well, all right. And very quickly, those two characters were the emotional core of the book, as far as the knights are concerned. And I realized I didn't really need anyone apart from them. I could have brought in all of the other knights, but the book would have got very crowded. And I quite enjoy having the knights there being mentioned as if we know who they are and as if we've met them. But in fact, they're just in the background and haven't been resurrected recently. And I enjoy them as characters. They don't really feature.
Yeah, I would love if you could talk a little bit about this. Is something I was so impressed by was the way you balance humor, because there's a very dry humor to it, especially like a lot of like Kay's observations in his head are just like very funny and very witty. So how do you balance the humor with the urgency of the situation that they are in? Because like something that I thought was very funny was that like, gosh, if like the last time that they were awake was, World War II, was like those were like relatively speaking, much simpler conflicts.
Yes, absolutely.
Problems than what they are dealing with in the present, because everything that he's dealing with in the present is systemic, like climate change and
absolutely.
inequality and everything, and so like, yeah, how do you balance the overall humor of the entire project with storytelling stakes, as it were?
That's a great question, and thank you. That's very kind of you to say that I've balanced them well. I think I'm lucky in that there's something inherently funny about the situation I've created. I think there's something inherently funny about these Arthurian knights trying to figure out what to do about climate change, which is obviously a problem that they can't solve with a sword.
Yeah.
And there's something inherently tragicomic about that, I think. And I do lean on that quite heavily, in that there's a certain, oh, what's the point of resignation to them, which is quite fun. I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. I do put them through quite a lot of difficult times, perilous times, in fact. But yeah, I think there's a certain inherent humor to it. But I also really want to make people laugh. That's sort of my main goal as a writer. If somebody tells me that they enjoyed my book, it was really well written, I'm very grateful. But if somebody tells me, oh, your book made me laugh, it was really funny, that's when I really light up and I feel like I've done a good job. That's always been an important part of the job for me, is to make people laugh. But humor is a very useful vehicle for important social commentary, I think. And that's something I learned from Terry Pratchett, who has always been one of my favorite writers. And I read the whole Discworld book when I was at school by taking them out of the library one at a time. And he taught me that a book can be funny whilst delivering a serious message, and that it doesn't take away from the sincerity or importance of the message for it to be kind of couched in humor. My mentor, Beth Underdown, who's one of my supervisors at the University of Manchester, says that my writing is funny but wearing a serious backpack. I've always thought that's quite a good way of putting it. And sometimes I get it the wrong way around, and it ends up being serious but wearing a funny backpack, and that's when I know I've done something wrong and I have to redress the balance slightly.
That's really interesting. And it does, like, it seems what is, like, how am I trying to say this? It seems strategically important too for actually addressing climate change, I think, because when
Yes, absolutely.
Climate, following climate experts and all that, like, there's a very important line to be walked between climate hope and climate despair,
Yes.
because, like, obviously the situation is dire, but if you give into despair, that is extremely demotivating, and then it's hard to do things. And so I think that delivering this content with, like, while paying respect to its urgency and it's important, but while also putting it in this like really funny and engaging wrapping paper is like a very nice good thing to have done.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, wrapping it up in a funny wrapping paper. But I think you're right, and I'm not interested in pretending that I don't cross that divide between doom and hope on a daily basis. Sometimes I feel like we're all doomed. Sometimes I feel like there's still hope. And I go back and forth quite a lot. And I went back and forth quite a lot while I was writing the book. And I wondered how optimistic the ending. Even I didn't know as I was writing it. I'm not a climate scientist. I follow a lot of very clever climate scientists on Twitter who all say different things. Some of them say that there is hope if we mobilize and get together, and others are starting to feel as if we've passed the point of no return, which is very frightening. And I was trying to capture both of those perspectives in the book and show that ultimately the difference between those two options is us. And as a community, as a species, we have a choice between those two. It's still not been decided.
Yeah, and that's really important, I think. So thank you so much for joining us. And I loved spending time with these characters. Do you ever see yourself returning to dealing with Arthurian characters in a fictional setting, or to these characters in particular? Like, what is on your writerly horizon?
Yes, I think there's more stories to be told with Gay and Lancelot and all of the other knights who we haven't really met yet. I was moving away from this world and writing something else, but I've ended up through various negotiations with my editors and basically just being drawn back to them and feeling like there's more stories that need to be told. I've now ended up back in a place where I'm going to be staying with these knights for a little bit longer at least. I'm excited about that. I'm excited to figure out what they were doing in the past and what the other knights were doing in the past and tell that side of the story. That's something I'm really excited about.
Oh, nice. Well, I hope that, when those when it is time for the world to see those projects, that maybe you'll consider coming back and talking to us again, because it was
absolutely
great to talk about this book, and I can't wait to see where this goes. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Listeners, please, please, please check out Perilous Times. By the time that you hear this, it will be available, so you can check it out at your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you get your books. Thank you so much for joining us, and it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.